Hello and welcome to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. And as always, I'm joined by my two wonderful co-hosts, Cate and Mike. How are you both today on this special occasion, our 300th episode?
Yeah, it's a special day indeed. I won't say I couldn't have imagined, but we really hoped, didn't we, Dave, all those years ago in 2018, 2019, when we were paving out our pilot EPs and we were wondering if we could string together 11. And I think we both said, wouldn't it be awesome if we could do a couple of hundred? And here we are, 300 episodes in.
300, feel like even more like old timers, Dave.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations, guys. It's a hell of a milestone.
Well, look, you're a big part of that milestone, Mike, and I'm not sure whether you know or not, but I did a little bit of research prior to this ep, and this is officially your 100th episode.
It is indeed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, we had a little bonus ep in there as well. I think we called it 200A, and that was your interview, your job interview.
Yeah, I remember that. And there was a bit of mystery about who is this guy? And some people recognise the voice, others like, I don't know who this guy is, but he sounds terrible.
No, you were funny. We loved it.
Your first official ep was 201, so that does make this your 100th or your 100th and a bit with that little intro one.
I'll take it. Got to run that single just to get across the line, right, Dave?
100%. You're raising the bat for the century and the team's on 300 runs.
You're getting away with it only because today is special.
So what we thought we'd do today is look at how the data, what's changed in the property market, the economy over the last 6 years since we first started recording. And then we might even look at that contrast over that 6-year period relative to the previous decade or even longer in some examples. So before we get into that, I just thought I'd give our listeners just a little bit of a walk down memory lane. So we way back in April 2019, Peter the property professor, Cate and myself got together to record 7 or 8 episodes in my old office in Camberwell Junction that overlooked the city. And I remember being really, really tired. Pete and I just being absolutely knackered about 4 episodes in. And Cate was just flying, bouncing along. And we went and had a walk and we got some photos done about halfway through to freshen us up. But and we lacked a bit of confidence. We weren't sure whether anyone would want to listen to us. So we actually put the episodes live on the Mentor List podcast because a client of mine, Dave Lewis, who runs that podcast, actually helped us run those first 7 or 8 episodes. Didn't he, Cate?
He did, yeah. And it was, he was instrumental in giving us our first glimpse of, recording studio vibes and how to structure things. And he gave us some good little hints. I know I'm letting our listeners behind the curtain here. We did 7 episodes, but we recorded them not in chronological order because we needed to make sure that we had, a fresh energy and we didn't, start the first one with nerves and lots of energy and then finish the 7th one all exhausted. So we toyed around. And I can't remember which one was actually the one we recorded 7th, but listeners probably would have picked it if we'll put it out there and see if anyone can. But yeah, it was a fun day and we had to get used to running recording gear ourselves. We had to get our heads around, the directional mics. And everybody speaks differently too. Like, Dave would sit back, Pete would yell, it was an interesting time for us to work out audio, but also to find that host chemistry. And that takes a little bit. And it's something that a lot of podcasters don't talk about, but you need to have the right chemistry with your people. And I think we found our feet pretty quickly.
Yeah, we did. And so we ran them up on Dave's already pre-existing podcast just to see how they'd go. And each of them had about 1,000 listens and we got good feedback. So we decided to set up our own podcast, which was called The Property Planner, Buyer and Professor. And the first episode officially went live on the 1st of July, 2019. So back then we used to record 6 to 7 eps at a time, didn't we, Kate?
Yeah. We didn't know about this online recording opportunity. We set up a podcasting studio. We soundproofed it, made sure you couldn't hear the boom gates and the trains, and bought the mics, bought the gear, and flew Pete over every few weeks.
Yeah, and so we did a few in my office then, which was just in the boardroom. But then you decked out your little studio to be actually, soundproof and set up for podcasting. And we'd only done a few recordings in there, and then in less than a year after we started, COVID hit.
Yeah.
So we were forced to just look at each other like we do now, and record from our offices or our studies, and that was a different little experience. But that is mostly how we do it now, isn't it?
Yeah. Enter the Yeti microphone. We had to buy microphones that plugged in and did the job, because no point sitting at a directional mic when your buddies are on Zoom. It was a tech revelation for us just to be able to switch, and there's still nothing that beats being together in the studio. The audio is great. It's lots of fun to see each other. The banter's
can feed
awesome.
off each other a bit better.
Yeah,
but plus you also have snacks.
Yeah, always manage snacks. Well, we had Pete Kalizos. Like, if you didn't have a pastry to start the day, couldn't lure him over here.
And then we fast forward through to 11th of April 2023, and Peter's hung up the bat. He's retired, and
gone to Greece, gone to Japan, gone back to Europe.
And Mike,
shout out, Pete.
Mike, shout out to Pete. We changed the name, rebranded to Property Trio, but all our episodes are on the Property Trio site now, which was formerly the mouthful of the Property Planner, Buyer and Professor. And I highly recommend our listeners go and listen to the first 20 or 30 episodes, where we unpack a lot of the gold of property buying, planning, financing, and money management. And then, Mike, you joined us.
I did. And yeah, if you are going back and listening to some, I remember in the beginning there was kind of an episode on Dave, an episode on Pete, an episode on Cate, and those were really good. I actually listened to all of them, I think, and I learnt some new things about you guys. They were really good. But yeah, I jumped on board. I was sort of podcasting as a solo thing with my own show with guests, so I guess I was match fit and got the call up. And it was an interesting ride. I think I'm a very different person to Pete. Whilst I love the guy and he's a mentor of mine, I've just got a different style, and that took a little while, I think, if you read the comments, for people to warm to. But I think we got there in the end.
Yeah,
I think most people warm to, and you can't please everyone, and that goes for all of us, I would think. So here we are, the 300th episode. So we thought, as I said at the start, we'd unpack what's changed in the last 6 years, and in the context of even a bit further back. So look, I thought we'd just start firstly with the value of total residential real estate. In May 2019, when we first recorded, it was worth 6.95 trillion. Today, it's now cracked over 11 trillion.
Isn't that incredible to think about that? When you look at that metric, it's not quite double, but in a 6-year period,
60%.
That's incredible.
It is, isn't it? It's just a great reminder for our listeners and everyone why, if you want to be an investor, to get into the property market, and that's not counting your rental returns over that period of time, but they're big numbers. And, having been, and you would see this, Cate, over my 25 years now in the industry, there always gets these moments where, surely the property market, there's a chatter, surely the property market can't keep growing. But there's this thing called inflation, and then there's many other factors that actually cause property values to outperform inflation, don't they?
Yeah, and particularly in our country. You get a lot of people challenging, let's talk about this nation, but Australian property, it's a very unique space for a lot of reasons. And I'm not suggesting that it will always do this, but right now with the drivers that are in place, we can anticipate that we'll continue to see property value growth.
Yeah, and New South Wales property value actually, coincidentally, just in the last few days, cracked 3 trillion.
Wow, that's a milestone.
It sure is. Okay, so anything to add to that, Mike? You're just sort of sitting back there listening to us talk about what property's done over the last 6 years?
I'm just sort of enjoying the show. I'm just like a fan listening in. Oh, look, there's a few kind of things that sort of stand out for me, you know, pre-COVID, mid-COVID and post-COVID. I mean, during COVID, we had the first recession in 30 years. I mean, that was an incredible thing to witness. I mean, the way that the government stepped in with, you know, JobKeeper, Job Seeker, and, you know, even some of the, you know, home builder initiatives, that was quite an incredible thing to witness. I mean, when I think about that and when I talk about that, I kind of think about the government that couldn't do an online census. I mean, that failed. The government that couldn't do like a referendum on gay marriage for under $100 million. Yet we can certainly all criticise the amount of expenditure that was thrown into the economy, and to many respects, we're still paying for it now. But some of the forecasts were 30% unemployment. Now, that would have been a terrible landscape to exist in Australia if that was the case. And we could have really had, you know, mass job losses. But for the government to come in and throw the cash around they did, they certainly kind of cauterized the losses that could have been there. Again, you know, maybe we overdid it. I think the evidence is there. We did overdid it. But to be able to get in there and to kind of rescue the country, you know, is quite an amazing thing to witness.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing to live through, isn't it? And yeah, there's sort of a lot of lessons, a lot of experiments that you can learn from, and the government can learn from, and investors can learn from over that period, because a lot of big decisions were crammed into a short space of time, weren't they?
Yeah.
I remember writing an article on LinkedIn mid COVID, and it was something along the lines of the economics of supply chains and toilet paper in Australia, because that was one of the most bizarre things to come out of that transition as well. I learned that domestically we produce a huge amount of toilet paper, you know, more than 60%, I think. But because it's such a bulky item, it runs on that just-in-time model. They don't store it at the shop. You know, it's in the warehouse and it gets there just in time. But if we had all just maintained our normal toiletry behaviours, there wouldn't have been an issue. But that panic buying,
it's that hoarding, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's a real weird thing that we've lived through, that future generations may never understand what that was like.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully not for another 100 years, like last time it happened with the Spanish flu. So if we move on to capitals versus regionals, and we've got a bunch of graphs that we'll share with our listeners for you to play along at home. So jump into our show notes and you can see the graphs we're talking to through this episode. What are some things you can notice there, Cate?
Sorry, Jamie, you have to help me out. My earbuds have just dropped out and I will be sounding awful. Sorry.
I got that echo too.
Yeah, I got the feedback. Yeah, there it is.
Yep, got you now. I'll just double check.
Hello. No feedback? No, good. But now I can't hear Cate.
No audio.
Would you like to be able to press that button occasionally on someone?
Sorry. I was excited about this chart. I love seeing the differential between the capital cities and the regions here, and it just tells such a big story, particularly when we factor in COVID as well. So on a very interesting note, though, when we had our downturn leading into the last federal election, and that was in May 2019, as most people will know, we had market declines almost across the board, and Sydney led the charge on that decline, and then Melbourne caught on about 6 months later, and things felt really awful. The top end of town definitely struggled, and it wasn't until we had our shock election result when we thought Shorten would be in and everyone was bracing for superannuation changes and negative gearing being mostly abolished. It was, and that was a tough period, especially for Sydney. They had huge declines, and as you can see,
we also had the Royal Commission in that lead up as well, which was putting a lot of fear around a lot of people in property, finance, mortgages.
So true. It was a bit of a trifecta, wasn't it, Dave? Because the other one was our credit squeeze really came to a head then. We'd been dealing with...
The banks are really tightening up.
They were.
Through the Royal Commission, yeah.
Yes. So we had that rollout. I guess that there's definitely a relationship between the Royal Commission and the credit squeeze, but they all came to a head in the federal election, and it was ugly. No one could get their hands on money. Credit was really tight. And we saw certainly the major capitals really take a hit, and especially the top end of town. And if you look on this chart, the decline was really strong and it was wide. So we felt it coming for a long time. And while we've got a sharp decline for the capital cities, the regions only just went into slight negative. And so what that says is that the softer, the lower markets, lower priced markets were a bit more resilient. And there's no surprises there because, there's a direct relationship between credit availability and the segments of the market that will be most impacted. So for that period of time, from about 2017, halfway through 2017 to pretty much just about when COVID hit our shores, the regions were outperforming the capitals. And then you can see the change when COVID hit and when lockdowns started to free up. Obviously, Melbourne's took a long time to free up, but into 2020, you can see both capital cities and regions just going through the roof. And that was an enormous gain. In fact, regions are sitting on about 30% and capital cities are sitting on 20-something, 23, 24%. Yeah. Enormous. But it was the regions that outperformed then, and they stayed strong all the way. And we've only just literally early 2023 seen the capital cities tick up a little bit. And then, as we know from our market update a couple of weeks ago, the regions just started to outperform the capital cities again from late last year. So it's been a real roller coaster and an interesting interplay. And, this chart shows that the regions don't always sit above the capitals. In fact, for most of the cycles, they've been below. But, COVID and post-COVID's changed that.
It has changed. It has changed, hasn't it?
Very much so.
COVID and post-COVID regionals have clearly outperformed the capital cities. And I think it's too early to know whether that's an ongoing trend or not. And I think, naturally, if regions get too pricey and their prices get too close to their relative capital cities, it can't go on forever. At some point, people will go, well, I'm not actually getting that much bang for my buck in a regional centre. I'll move back into the city. But, over the last decade, they've outperformed by 2%, which is a large sum of money when you compound that off, whether it's an original price of 500,000 or 750,000. Maybe Mike can do the quick numbers on what 2% differential compounded over 10 years is on 500,000 or 750. That's going to be a decent number when Mike shares it with our listeners. But while he's working that out, you can also see that the regionals do seem to follow broadly what's happened in the capital cities, but just a little bit later.
Yes.
So, if we look at the capitals, and that doesn't look like it does actually look like what's happening for the whole of the last decade. So in 2015, capital cities went up and then regions started to go up. Then the capital cities came down around 2016. Regionals came down a little bit, but like we spoke about, it's not the big peaks and troughs of the capital cities. Then the capital cities risen again about later in 2016. Then the regionals went up. Capital cities started to drop 2017 all the way through to 2019. And then the regionals followed a little later. Then they started to recover after the election. Then the regionals started a little bit later. The capital cities had the fall for COVID, but then didn't last long and bumped up again. Started coming down, or the price growth started to slow in around 2022. Regions just after that, and that was the same again in terms of the recovery of 2023. The regions began just after that. So, that certainly is an insight for any investor if you're willing to get into a regional market. And you've still got to pick the right property, the right city. There's lots of different major cities in regionals, but there's definitely a trend that the regions tend to follow a little bit of a lag, not a lot of lag, behind the capital cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to look at the weight of the big cities and the number of transactions. And if we look at population across our nation, Sydney and Melbourne combined account for more than a third of the entire nation.
Yep.
And so when those markets aren't doing well, which they haven't in the last, quartile or last couple of quartiles actually, that certainly gives the regions a head start.
It does. It has a big drag. And like, for example, if some point Melbourne and Sydney rebound together, which often they do move relatively in lockstep, not always, but it then might close some of that 2% differential over the last decade. Did you happen to work out that compound?
Yeah, if we took, say, a $500,000 asset, 2% annual compound over 10 years is $609,000. So we're talking an extra $109,500 roughly as a differential.
On $500,000. So then you're talking, that's an extra probably $230,000, $240,000 on $1 million invested.
It's meaningful.
It's
right?
meaningful.
If you can outperform the market by 2%, you're definitely winning.
Yeah, 100%. All right, Sophie. Yeah.
Just another point on the population side of things. Obviously, we saw immigration go to the floor, and we got a very rare chance to see what that actually does to a property market. I mean, an economist can put that into a model, but it's a very different thing to shutting the airports to international visitors, right? And I think we were one of the first countries to do that. And the net result in places like Melbourne, to a lesser extent, some of the high density areas of Sydney and Brisbane, we actually started to see double-digit vacancy rates.
Around the point, CBDs.
Yeah, absolutely. Like places like South Bank in Melbourne, certain pockets around Fortitude Valley in Brisbane, and some of the sort of more western areas like Homebush in Sydney. And it actually led me to create my own index because, I don't know, I've just got some sort of Messiah complex.
Kind of guy.
I thought that'd be cool if I had my own index. So I created the rental loss index. Now,
that kind of Mortlock rental loss index.
There you go. So we actually got lots of really good interest from the media because we charted the top 10 suburbs in the country that were where the landlords were losing the most. So we looked at what the aggregated rental would be. We looked at, say, the house versus unit split, and then we balanced the median house rental versus the unit rental, and we were able to see where the big losses were. That was a very successful index for about a year, and it now doesn't exist because rental losses aren't really a thing with vacancy rates that were around, I think we got down to like 0.9%, and it hovered around 1.1 for a long time. It was a really wild thing to witness.
I loved those chats with you. You'd be like, Cate, what's the go with this crazy suburb?
Yeah, it was always Caulfield East, I think. And
you picked student towns, and they were down because we weren't taking students.
Well,
I didn't know that, but you educated me that is, that's a university campus.
Yeah. Well, it's a great example too of how the weakest markets perform the weakest during downturns. And so what types of properties were in these locations? They were predominantly medium to high density apartments, new apartments, newish apartments, small apartments. So they were the ones that, people didn't live in when things were tough, when the market was flat. They were most impacted. So it was a really good lesson for our listeners who have been paying attention over the last 300 episodes to what some of our education. So it's a good segue into rental growth. What's happened with rents in the last 6 years? Cate, do you want to give a bit of a summary of what we see here on this graph?
Yes. So rental values, Jay, it was awful. If anyone is out there trying to find a property, or particularly a couple of years ago, renters, tenants, however we use. Sorry, I'll start that again. Yeah, Dave, it's a great conversation, although not great if you're a renter or a tenant. We saw a lot of significant changes, and what happened during COVID lockdowns really relates to the number of people per household. And we also saw, unfortunately, a lot of relationship breakdowns as well, with the stress of everything that came with COVID and lockdowns and financial pressures. So we saw a lot of Australians spreading themselves out and looking for properties. We saw house sharers going out there looking for single bedroom apartments, and obviously divorcees and separated people were looking. So all of a sudden the demand went through the roof. And despite the fact that we didn't have international arrivals and we lost a lot of international students, we still didn't have enough housing. It was really tough. And then, of course, we saw a lot of investor-led...
And it was hard to build as well.
Hard to build. Yeah, building starts, just ground to a halt. A lot of investor-led sales, not necessarily because of legislation changes, but some of which, and a lot of turmoil for the lockdown cities that had to manage tenants who couldn't pay their rent, and for those locations that had an eviction moratorium placed on them, that added a lot of financial pressure to landlords whose tenants didn't or couldn't pay their rent. So, that was tough. And we saw a lot of sales during that time as well. And then overlay that with legislative reforms and really tough conditions for landlords, we saw a lot of properties get sold. And I'm not talking about recent days where interest rates have ticked up and that's forced a lot of hands as well. So during that time, while we've got household formation rates at their lowest levels ever, and people looking outside of their capital city, and some of which living their houses unoccupied, and we saw a bit of that as well, people running away to the country because we didn't know how long we'd be locked down. So let's just take a 6-month lease or stay somewhere temporarily.
A lot of people buying second homes during that period of time because we're building up cash. No one had money to spend.
Interest rates were at 2%.
Wealthier. Interest rates were super low, so it felt really affordable to be able to do.
Yeah, it was chaotic. So hence we've seen rental increases because that supply and demand equation kicked into gear. And it really affected some regions and centres harder than others. If you went to the Gold Coast, which a lot of people did, they ran away to the Gold Coast, that got hit with so many new arrivals from Victoria and New South Wales. Getting a rental in the Goldie was near on impossible, and you absolutely had to pay a premium. And the reason I know that is one of my staff left to Queensland in between lockdowns, and they've relocated up there permanently now. But for them,
there was
just
so
getting
many of those stories, wasn't
heaps,
there? Particularly from Melbourne, of people relocating. And look, we, as you know, I didn't really share it on the podcast, so our listeners were none the wiser. But my family and I escaped essentially the second 100-day lockdown from Melbourne. And it was fortuitous, and really because just as soon as that first lockdown ended, I just said we'd been renovating. It'd been really stressful, obviously, with the business. 3 young kids at home. Luke was in prep. Josh was his first year of kinder, trying to run a business. Sarah couldn't work in the business. She's trying to teach Luke in prep, look after Josh, and then have Annabelle, who was like still in nappies. So I said, we're going on a holiday. And we did have a big family holiday booked, which we weren't able to do overseas. And it just so happened as we were leaving Melbourne, the first lockdowns in those high-rise flats were happening. And so we're in Avoca Beach in northern or just above north of Sydney. And the numbers just kept going up in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And
you
so
could read the writing on the wall, couldn't you?
Yeah, and it was even stressful being there because you just were still in that stage where you just thought, is this going to cause lots of deaths? What's going to happen to our city? And anyway, we ended up living up in Nambucca Heads with my parents and my sister's families up that way as well, near Coffs Harbour. But the difference was so stark compared to Melbourne. Being able to go out and eat, it was just
Yeah, I got
it
my touch
felt
of sunshine
liberating.
every time I
Yeah.
saw you and Pete each week online. Me in my dark, dingy little bedroom, feeling sorry for myself. You on the beach. It was nice actually getting just a glimpse of that and a taste of that once a
Yeah.
week. That sounds quite sad, doesn't it? But it was pretty depressing in Melbourne.
It was so depressing in Melbourne. Yeah, I think I'd look at my staff in our morning meetings, and they were just so flat.
Yeah, we had
Uh,
tears like every second morning. It was awful.
it wasn't fair to Melburnians, and I don't know, yeah, if anyone will let their city or state be locked down like that again. But I think there's a lot of issues because of that. But so that, yeah, but if we get back to, I guess, the rental, we haven't seen rental increases like that really since, and levels of rental growth since around 2008, 2009. It's been a long time. And I guess one saving grace is that rents had been pretty flat really for at least a decade, as Peter had pointed out. So there was a bit of catching up to do with rents, wasn't there? But still, that was those rental jumps were big, were tough to take for any renters.
I remember
Yeah.
that research of Pete. He looked at rental growth over a 25-year period and found that it underperformed inflation for that whole time. So it wasn't the case that rents were too expensive. They just became too expensive too quickly. It was the pace of change, very similar
That's
to
right.
interest
Yeah.
rates, right? It was the unprecedented rise in interest rates. We've never seen interest rates rise that quickly. And rents
Yeah.
followed a very similar trajectory. And there were all sorts of media stories about, people on sort of government capped locations where the rent had sort of stayed the same for 10 years and then it would go onto the market. And, the differential was massive. People were just really, really struggling.
Yeah. And you'd hear the stories of the lineups to, just apply for a rental property, and there'd be 50, 60 people waiting outside rentals. Pretty unprecedented. I'm sure it's happened at some point a long time ago. But so what's that done to gross rental yields and our return on rents over the last 6 years, and how does that sort of look over a 10-year period?
Yeah, it's a good question. The rental yields chart is not quite telling the same story as you'd expect it to. And I think the secret to mapping rental yields is to map it by region or by state or by capital territory, because we've seen a lot of value growth in over the last 2 or 3 years in the likes of Perth, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, and of course their yields have come down as a result of that. And Melbourne's yield has jumped dramatically because we've been anemic or static or whatever word you want to use for our performance. So
And Darwin's as well. Don't leave out Darwin.
yeah, I can't leave out Darwin. So you can see that yields, though, this curve shows a definite dip during that crazy capital growth run of 2021, 2022. And that is what you expect. You tend to find that yield is like an inverse curve to capital growth, and it's exactly done that.
Yeah. So property values are flying, rents don't grow at the same rate. So your rental yield becomes lower.
Yeah. What I love about this rental yield curve, though, is it does show that tight elasticity between 3 and 4%. And that is what you want to see, because rental yield long term should really be hovering, at a pretty static kind of band, as opposed to super highs and super lows. But you do see that movement tricks down when capital growth tricks up.
Yeah. Talk about mean reversion there, right? Like we haven't seen that many bigger international shocks that could kind of test that. But yeah, like it moved and then it sort of found its way back to that equilibrium.
Yes. Yeah.
So we were probably around about 3.9 6 years ago on average across the nation.
Yeah.
And then now it's sitting at around 3.7, but it probably got down as low as 3.2. So there certainly has been, it is an example of moving towards a mean reversion,
Yeah.
isn't it? And if we look over a 10-year period, we had the regionals were up at around 5.3%, got down to probably as low as about 4.1, and now they're sitting about 4.4. So they've certainly taken a hit. And why have they taken a hit on their rental returns? Because their value growth has outstripped the capital cities by a couple percent over that period. Whereas if we look at the capital cities 10 years ago, we're sitting up at around 4%, and they got down into as low as about 3% at the height of the price appreciation during COVID. And now they've worked their way back up to that mid-range, haven't they, around 3.5%.
Yeah.
Now, probably the biggest challenge for our property market is building enough new houses. And obviously that is something that the government is trying to push, and every government and major political party wants to find a solution to be able to build enough new houses for our growing population. What can you tell us with this dwelling approvals graph? What does it? What can you share with our listeners?
Are you talking to Mike?
I'll jump in. I think we've got to take a moment to consider what actually happened during COVID and how that played into approvals. So we saw a 33% increase in material price inputs during COVID. We saw a huge amount of these big manufacturing plants get shut down, and then a big problem with global supply chains. I mean, Cate and I were talking about the Freightos Baltic Index, which sort of sounds like a Bakos Index. That was the cost to move shipping containers around the country, and it went through the roof, around the world, I should say. We did fairly quickly have high interest rates, and the government's, looking to build this 1.2 million homes in 5 years, but the construction industry still is the number one industry for insolvencies or liquidations in the country. And the big problem that is now different in the building game is that the majority work on fixed price contracts, right? And if you think about the beginning of COVID, we had builders that were just kind of wanting to survive, right? So what did they do? They secured a pipeline of work on low margins. They're like, okay, we're not going to make a fortune, but we're just going to survive. So, they might have been doing things on, 6 or 7% margin. But then when you have material prices, things like timber and steel that just grew way higher than 33%. Then they were locked in on these long-term contracts, because many of these contracts can go for a year or two at a loss. So they were stuck with this fixed price contract. So when people were calling us or saying, oh, the builder's asking for more money, a lot of the times we were saying it's actually probably a good idea to try and chip in, because otherwise they're just going to go bankrupt. And then you're dealing with a half-completed property, which is always more expensive to rebuild, because the new builder has to assume that liability. And then, of course, after COVID, we had a huge pipeline of infrastructure projects that was taking trades away from building homes, and quite a few natural disasters that required rectification works as well. So we can see...
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing too that we can forget at times is there was the big incentives just to renovate. So people were getting a lot of money for that renovation incentive boost. And so a lot of builders were doing these smaller jobs as well. So they were taken away to renovating and not even doing full builds. So that meant,
And on that point, Dave, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I have the data right in front of me. We were looking at the percentage of property investors that renovate after they bought their property, and in 2021 it was 37.25%, whereas in the last calendar year it was 19.69%.
There you go.
So it's dropped a fair bit. And also the cost or the amount that they spent. 2021, it was just over 30 grand. In 2024, it's 12 grand. So that kind of tells the story. We did have a renovation boom. We had Bunnings run out of timber Now, that's the first time I've ever seen that before, and we may never ever see that again. So you're right. There was a lot of activity in the rectification modification space.
Did you say the average renovation was 30,000 down to 12,000?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't necessarily big renovations.
How?
These are just
We're renovating. I can tell you, there's a couple more noughts on top of that.
An improvement might be a better way to characterize it. So, people that come in and they do something, it might just be some carpets and blinds, but, the percentage of people doing that has dropped and the amount that they've spent has dropped as well.
Yeah. Cate, did you have any takeaways to add to that with regards to dwelling approvals?
Yeah, look, we had a deficit of everything, materials, trades. We had all of these big build projects going. In my own state, we've got cranes and roadworks and train works and road closures and train closures and buses replacing trains. Like the list goes on. That sucked a lot of tradies out of the community and into the civil works projects without earning a mozza. And it just made it so expensive. And I can see a two-speed economy still, well, a two-speed market when it comes to houses. Every single super renovator or knockdown is going for a bargain price and no one wants to bid for it. And everything that's renovated has got multiple bidders on it, paying whatever it takes. So our market hasn't calmed down yet. We still have a lot of our trades tied up in these infrastructure projects, and it's definitely distorted the market.
Yeah, and if you look at the graph, if you go back to around 2011, we saw a rise in dwelling numbers being built, probably in line with population growth, from about 2011 for houses and units up to about 2015. And then it sort of flatlines and then it falls. And like with houses and units, we are below where the number of dwellings being built were at literally a decade ago, but our population hasn't stopped growing over that decade. And that's why these sort of 5-year and 10-year averages can be a bit of a misnomer, because they should factor in they should at least be increasing relative to population growth. And we're one of the fastest countries in the world with growth in our population, if not number one, because of our high migration intake from overseas migration intake. So we just aren't building enough houses, and I think supply is the big issue if you want property prices to stay more stable in line with inflation. And I just don't think that's a problem that's going to be solved.
And to exacerbate
for
that population issue, Dave, we had a contraction of household formation rates. And I remember one particular economist just looking at, say, separations, that equated to a requirement of an extra 122,000 dwellings just for people that, divorced or what have you during COVID. So that's a meaningful amount when we're trying to build 240,000 a year with the government's target. I mean, half of that was just added to the bill, right?
Yeah. So that continues to be an issue, but a driver of property prices. So what happened with the cash rate over the last 6 years? Quite a story to tell.
Yeah, the emergency levels, unfortunately, psychologically became a new norm for a lot of people.
Yeah. So we went from just I'll quickly jump in May 2019 when we started the podcast. The cash rate was 1.5, and then between 2019 and 2020. It got brought down to 0.1%, unprecedented, where it stayed until May 2022. And then we've had 13 cash rate increases in the space of a year, 2022 to 2023, back up to 4.35 before that most recent, obviously, 0.25% reduction. So a yo-yo.
And if you look at that, we'll put all of this in the show notes. If you look at the 2009 drop, that was obviously stimulated by the GFC. We had emergency levels then. I was working as a mortgage broker, and I know I've said this before on the show. I remember calling so many clients saying, oh my gosh, we've got to talk about refinancing because your interest rate is is sitting just below 5%. I think the lowest I locked someone in on was like 4.79, and that was like emergency levels and
That was
ridiculously cheap. No one had
a
seen that
4
for,
in front of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
for
That
decades.
was
And
low rates for decades.
historically
Really low.
low.
Yeah.
And when we were at 4% only a few years ago, people were saying, oh my God, I can't believe it. I locked in at 4%. I could have been at 2%. So, these emergency levels were so crazy low. I had to keep reminding people this can't stay forever. I mean, if it does, it signals that our economy is in dire strife. And unfortunately, a lot of people did acclimatise to that. And of course, it was a really nasty surprise when we had that shock increase that you just went through, Dave.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of people and too many, unfortunately, of our clients as well, locked in for just the 2 years on the low rate because the banks were smart. They didn't think it would be this low for that long, and so their special discounts on fixed rates are only for 2 years. So we've just got some of the last of our clients who locked in like with a one number for 5 years, coming off their 1.9s, 1.5 year fixed rates now. But a lot of people, only made the most of it for a couple of years during that period of time. And that's why it's always so good to have that, a 10, 20 year or even longer perspective when you're making investment decisions, because it just helps you with your perspective and not losing sight of, where you are in a cycle or what's the likelihood of what's going to happen over that longer term when you're caught up in the moment and the time of the situation.
Yeah, very true.
So if we move on then, what did these low rates do to the take-up of fixed-rate home loans? I'll answer that for Alice.
I can if you want.
So what happened? So what this meant was we had unprecedented numbers of people lock in on fixed rate loans. So historically in Australia, you have generally about like a 95 to 5 split. 95% of people write out the variable rate, and a lot of the data will show that if you write out a discounted variable rate, you will win over time in comparison to fixed rates. You've got a time when you fix quite well, obviously leading into rates starting to rise for it to pay off for you. But because rates were so low, a lot of people did make the most of fixing, and around between sort of early 2021 to almost 2022, we had up around 25% of loans being fixed off the historical norm of around 5%. So that was huge numbers, which it's now back down to that sort of 3 to 5% average. But yeah, a lot of people did make the most of fixing during that period of time.
I think a lot of credit goes to mortgage brokers as well. I want to give them a shout out because they absolutely understood that this was an emergency rate and they were never, ever going to be better. I mean, let's face it, the cash rate was 0.1%. You can't really get lower than that unless you're in Japan. And they were reminding people, just fix. And I think, those that had a close relationship to their strategic mortgage broker did really well.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully a lot of our listeners did, because I kept reminding them how low rates were and that it was definitely worthwhile considering fixing for 3 to 5 years. And I must admit, we fixed for 5 years for the first time I ever have in my life, and
Really?
I'm still making the most of some of those low rates.
Oh, that's so good. I used to have this saying years ago with Ian when we started our investing journey, because obviously fixing gave us, clear control of our cash flow, and we like to model that because we were acquiring properties as rapidly as we could. And my rule of thumb was if the fixed rate for 3 years is under 6.25, we fix.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that puts
sign of the times, isn't it?
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we've now got a chart showing the amount of lending going to investors, and it's pretty stark, really. Mike or Cate, would either of you like to just share a little bit of the story over the last 6 years and perhaps in the context of, what it's looked like over the last decade or even longer?
Yeah, I'd love to say, to keep it succinct, this chart is a perfect reflection of credit policy. There's a total correlation where the credit diminished. That's where the chart diminishes. They're so in line, it's not funny. And obviously credit loosened after COVID, and investor lending tricked right up from late 2021 to current day. The average is 33.8. Now, I think that's a decade average. And we're currently sitting at 38.3. So, we're nearly 5% over the decade average. We did have
it was on a steady decline, basically, wasn't it, from around 2016? And that, if we just look at, and we've done an episode. I did a bit of an episode on that history of the changes to the mortgage legislation. So in December, at the end of 2014, APRA introduced that minimum serviceability buffer of 2 percentage points above the loan interest rate, which is now at 3 percentage points. So that was one of the things that started to slow down lending. And then there became caps on how much investor lending couldn't grow by more than 10% with the lenders. Then there also were caps on how many of their borrowers could take out interest-only loans. Then they also changed serviceability, where if you took an interest-only loan where you had to service over the remaining principal and interest period, so if you had 5 years of interest-only, you'd borrow a lot less because your serviceability would be over 25 years instead of 30 years. So there were a bunch of these factors that contributed to investor numbers. And this is what they wanted to stop. Like 2014, we had investor percentage at 45%. And it was just too high. It was too hard to get into a home. And then they have gradually come down to September 20, where they investor financing numbers were around 23%. But now it's pushed back up to 38%. So it's actually, the decade average has been about 33, which is like 1 in 3 for our listeners, which is probably where historically numbers have sit between owner-occupier investors. So, they really made it hard for investors for a long period of time, didn't they?
They really did. Yeah, it was just more and more difficult. And they obviously carried it on for far longer than they needed to, because, as we saw, it created a property decline across the nation, and it was tough.
Yeah. And I think also, whilst rates were rising, we saw in the finance world, if we're talking in the finance world, this new invention to create business for the banks, and that was the cash back offers for refinancing.
Yes. And
that was a good time for mortgage brokers and lenders and borrowers, where, you'd get $2,000, $4,000, sometimes even more, to swap lenders on top of any sort of interest rate discounts. So that was because rates were going up, people weren't refinancing as much, it was harder to refinance. And because so many people were taking out fixed rate loans, less people were able to refinance. So they added in this incentive to encourage it.
That was good fun when they were fighting for our business.
Yeah.
I've got to go to the airport. Are we close to the end, or I can leave this running and have someone come and hit stop?
All right. Well, let's just wrap up then.
Okay.
So look, I think that's it. That we did have one last chart on first home buyers over the last decade, but look, pretty much they're in line. We won't with what they have been historically, so we won't go into too much detail there. But I think that's been a great walk down memory lane.
It has indeed.
What's changed over the last 6 years, and then we've even looked a bit longer as well, haven't we? But a lot. There's been a lot.
A lot, except gross rental yields.
So Mike has to rush off to the airport. So we might just end the episode quickly unless anyone wants to provide a quick gold nugget.
No, I reckon we've gone for a long one as well, so I reckon we're safe not to.
All right. Thanks, guys. It's been great fun recording the last 300 episodes with you, Cate, and the last 100 with you, Mike.
Likewise.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
You guys are great musketeers.